That was a stupid idea, he said. A few months ago, I began a short series of sermons about right relationships using a book called Practicing Right Relationships, Skills for Deepening Purpose, Finding Fulfillment, and Increasing Effectiveness in Your Congregation. Sounds like a good one to buy. By Mary Kay Sellen and Daniel Smith. And so I'm using that as a guide today. Now, you may not remember anything about what I said back in October, but you might remember the skit that we did. 2 members of a fictional new members welcome committee, and how they had a debate about what gift to give the new members of the church. In the skit, which was based on a story in the book, each committee person proposed the perfect gift based on their own memory of gifts of love or gifts that they had always wanted but never got. Because they'd had different backgrounds, one favored homemade cookies, while the other wanted to give an elegant, professionally made water bottle. Do you remember? And each hated the other one's idea. They saw the other one was disruptive, unuseful, and they so disliked the other one that they were almost ready to quit. This sort of thing happens. Deep values lead to seemingly unreconcilable differences. And then one day in the story, they learned about how life experiences had shaped each other's values. And suddenly they understood why the 2 proposals were so radically different. That was a sermon on values. In the second sermon of the series, I'll use the next chapter from the book, Practicing Self-Management, as an inspiration. And the drum major instinct is the major example that I'm going to draw from because it's fresh in our minds. Sellen and Smith's thesis for this chapter is impulsive, unconscious, just letting it all hang out expressions of emotion do not serve self or others. They separate people and put them on the defensive. Clear and straightforward words and actions made by choice and guided by an awareness of purpose foster communications and right relationships. And they define self-management as making choices regarding our perspectives, feelings, and actions that support our values, our dreams, and our understanding of God's dream for this world. Clearly and straightforwardly, Sellen and Smith are writing from a Christian perspective. It's hard to find books on congregational systems that aren't from this sort of point of view. But I mentally substitute a universalist vision of beloved community and leave aside the idea that God either sleeps or dreams, and that we can understand God's dream. And then I focus on the jewel that they've exposed, that we have a choice at every moment, a choice of actions, a choice of feelings, a choice of perspectives. There are many ways to get to the ultimate goal. I've spent the last couple of weeks reading Dr. King's works, his autobiography, some speeches, some essays, prayers, and a new collection of his sermons. And I see him as a master of perspective. He came from Atlanta, Georgia, went to seminary in a mostly white seminary, actually, just across the Commodore Barry Bridge in Chester, PA. And then even farther north to Boston University for a PhD. And then back down south to Alabama, back to a world where carpetbaggers from the north were not particularly well liked. King went through many different perspectives, from the fundamentalism of his youth to liberal Christianity, and Unitarianism and Universalism called themselves liberal Christian faiths in those days, and understood things in terms of the social gospel, to neo-orthodoxy, and then on to nonviolence. His journey gave him enough practice in seeing situations from different angles that he was able to use perspective change in his teaching. In our performance this morning, Dr. King tells of James and John wanting to be drum majors in the beloved community Jesus will found. And Jesus tells them essentially, if you want to be drum majors, you must be servants. In the drum major instinct, Dr. King says, now very quickly we would automatically condemn James and John, and we would say that they were selfish. And then he says that this desire to lead the parade is worthy of condemnation, at least from the perspective of the we sitting in the pews in Atlanta that day. I imagine hearing the reading that he gave and saying to myself, James and John were uppity disciples. They'd violated the essential law of our community. You know, the one that Marge Piercy expresses in her poem, part of which is in one of our readings. I love people who harness themselves, an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like a water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud and the muck to move things along, to do what has to be done again and again. I want to be with people who submerge in the task, who go into the fields to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along, who are not parlor generals or field deserters, but move in a common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire be put out. And so King starts talking about uppityness from different perspectives. He even changes that classic phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, saying they just live their lives trying to outdo the Joneses. Sellon and Smith tell a story about a man who's going to a meeting to do battle on some issue. And they have him shift his perspective before he gets there. Instead of just thinking about himself as being a sort of a warrior, they have him think about, what does the cat think about this? What do my children's blocks think about this? What does the sports writer in the newspaper think about this? And it gives him some distance so he can understand that he's in that role of warrior when he gets to the meeting. Dr. King looks at uppityness from several perspectives: James and John, a drum major in a parade, an insecure whiskey drinker, a woman preparing for a dinner party, a driver heading to work. And then he shifts to the church, a bragging minister, a PhD or teacher in the audience, a worker who has no degree, who doesn't even understand the second law of thermodynamics. What's uppity for each of these people? What do they feel about it? And then there's Dr. King himself. He spent over a decade being the leader, and some say the figurehead, of the civil rights movement. No doubt he sat in meetings where others saw his actions, his position as being uppity, as maybe a carpetbagger who came in to tell people what to do. When preachers preach, they preach to themselves too. Was he being uppity? By presenting this swirl of perspectives, King buys his credibility. He engages with the audience and tells them, yes, I'm trying to see this from your point of view. Just as in his letter from Birmingham jail, he tells white clergy that he sees things from their perspective too. He knows their values. He sees their inaction in civil rights as being something that doesn't match with their beliefs. And just as in the I Have a Dream speech, where he takes on the perspective of white and black parents. Just as his promoting of the Poor People's March on Washington aimed to show that he could have the perspective of poor white people as well as poor black people. Guided by an awareness of purpose, Sellon and Smith say, foster connection and right relationships. In Drum Major Instinct, Dr. King spends some of his time challenging the notion that uppity equals bad, even though in this world there are plenty of ways where uppity disheartens and divides people. He shifts the conversation away from the role of drum major to the goal. What are you leading us into? Is your purpose one that includes us? Or are you lost in self-aggrandizement? Or is this purpose something we should take notice of and work together? He tells his audience, yes, be uppity, but be uppity for a good reason. And then he shifts again. Will people remember him as an uppity black man? A man with a big trophy case in his office so that he can be reminded of his Nobel Prize, his other honors, those fancy degrees. And suddenly we hear the perspective of Mr. Martin Luther King, Jr., a 39-year-old man who's more than a little scared. Was it worth it? He says, yes. Did he do the right things? Yes. Is there a chance that people will remember the person instead of the soundbite version of his life? I sure hope so, he says. "45 years later, in a galaxy far, far away, here we sit." This isn't a packed house at a big church in downtown Atlanta. We're not at the center of much of anything, except the beautiful weather today. Richard prepared plenty of coffee, regular and decaf. And Sellon and Smith tell us to get practicing and understand perspective and right relationship. That drama we did back in October, we were talking about values. And tied in were values were the perspectives of the two committee members, childhood values that came from their personal stories. And when the two committee members were able to step back and see things from each other's perspective, growth could happen. As a minister in training, I was admonished to see everything in a variety of perspectives. Sometimes that explains why it takes so long for me to answer a question, because I have to answer it mindfully, I suppose. A few months ago, one of our members brought a very beautiful plant that she'd bought for our grounds. It would be lovely out there, visible from our porch. But I knew that other people in the congregation would not see it as lovely. You see, we've made a conscious effort to landscape our grounds using native plants, to be part of the native ecosystem. And for those who value this effort, a beautiful South African shrub would be no. There we go. Mom said it right. No, not a good idea. And so I saw the emotions, the valuable emotions on both sides. I saw the perspective of unified landscape and the perspective of vibrant beauty. And I wondered, would this member go home with the unwanted plant saying they didn't like my idea? We had been turned into they. In this case, it was not so bad. The member was able to see the other perspective, learn about why it is that our grounds looks the way it does, saw the reasons, and they took the plant home and planted it there. When a visitor comes in our door, which word, which perspective is heard, we or they? We know, I hope, to ask not what college the visitor attended, to tell not stories that rely on understanding of special or general relativity, to not suddenly break into Greek or Latin. We know to value each individual. Woo. That takes effort to see us, to see this place from many perspectives, including the perspective of the stranger coming in our door. I have a story about a congregation that I was in a few years ago. A person came for the first time, and they heard the singing of the children downstairs. Now, they'd been used to a church where the kids had to sit through the service and parents had to sort of nudge them to keep them quiet. And just the idea that we not only let them go downstairs, but actually honored them as they left was just mind-blowing. It was like, I have to be part of this because it's beautiful. Where is it that we show our beauty? Where is it that we show the good stuff that's here? Now, life would be simpler if I could find page 7. But it doesn't much matter. Could be here. No, it couldn't be there. Here we go. So, this'll do. Yeah, I'll use this one. Anyway, let's be mindful of how we do coffee. I went and visited at some point, I went and visited a congregation where they had a sort of a long corridor, and at the very end of it, they had the coffee pot and the creamer and all the cups. And people would go and get their coffee, and then they'd turn and start to talk to the person next to them, and everybody else would sort of bounce up and down until they finally sort of nudged them out of the way and were able to get their coffee, and then they turned and talked to the people that were next to them. And the goal is to grow the perspective so that you can be the person back at the end of the line who's trying to figure out who these people are. After the coffee hour, or coffee half hour, or even just gulping and going, when you go off to the committee meetings, and I think there are several of them today, I invite you to be aware of how you participate in the conversations that will invariably happen at these meetings, either by talking or by listening. I invite you to think about what perspective you're using, what feelings that perspective allows. Are you being a warrior, a champion for some position? Are you being an appeaser, trying to calm down everyone else, no matter what the cost? Are you feeling that what they're talking about is an assault on you, and that you're somehow shamed into silence? And maybe if what you're feeling isn't helpful, or is painful, you might ask for a timeout. Everybody know what a timeout is? It doesn't have to involve going and sitting in the corner. It can just involve sitting quietly for a moment. Sitting quietly for a moment and saying, what's going on here? This is what I'm feeling. How can I shift my perspective to understand why you are saying this and why you are saying that? Because the perspective I've got is that we're all working towards beloved community. We all want something. We just have different ideas about how to get there. Let us forgive ourselves and each other. Let us begin again in love. This past Thursday in our midweek announcements, I wrote about the march in Raleigh, North Carolina, to lift up the perspectives of those who are being excluded, who are not being heard in the North Carolina legislature. And I hope, if any of you feel moved to go, that you find a community to travel with. I know that there are other Unitarian Universalists in New Jersey who will be going to Raleigh, and maybe you can join them. I've thought about it, and I see my job from the perspective of somebody who has to be a pastor here this winter. And I can't lead on this, but it doesn't mean that my heart doesn't want to go. So, is there a happy ending to the story? Did James and John get to sit on the left and right side of Jesus? Did Martin Luther King lead our nation to a better understanding of love? Did this congregation, even event by event, day by day, become an embodiment of beloved community? I guess how it ends depends on your perspective. Amen.